Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to change out front and rear wheel bearings on your Polaris side-by-side. Wheel bearings are one of those things that often get overlooked, but they do need to be checked periodically, and that way it'll help you prevent having a breakdown out on the trail. Now, we noticed our machine had a funny stance in the rear end. We lifted it up and found some play in that rear wheel bearing. So we need to get that changed out, and this process will be similar for your Polaris RZRs, your Rangers, your Generals. There is gonna be some minor differences with suspension components, like having a trailing arm versus having an A-arm, but those are really minor differences. But for those reasons, you do want to refer to your model-specific service manual for more information and specs. To do this job, we need some common hand tools, and some of the specific tools will vary from machine to machine, but you're going to need a torque wrench no matter what, and then a bearing and seal driver. So there's more than one way to get this bearing out of here. The easiest and best way is with a press, but since most people watching this probably won't have a press, we're just going to show how to do it with the bearing and seal driver. And then you're either going to have a collar, or you can use a couple of blocks of wood to get that driven out. And you're also going to want to either have a torch or a heat gun to help heat up that bearing carrier. And then other than that, we're using some mechanics gloves, rags, safety glasses, and then we also have that special socket for our lug nuts. Now, as far as parts and consumables go, we have a Tusk wheel bearing kit. This is the most important piece, and this kit comes with 2 bearings. So anytime you're doing your wheel bearings, if it's the rear wheel bearings you're doing, you want to do both sides at the same time, or same thing with the front, do both at the same time. So convenient kit, or if you want to buy individual bearings, you can go under the OEM diagram and get that OEM part along with the snap ring and your cotter pins. Other than that, we're going to use waterproof grease, contact cleaner, some Loctite, so we have blue, and then also this green stuff. This also doubles as a bearing retainer, and we'll also be using some rubber gloves. Now, this machine we're working on is a Polaris RZR XP 1000, but again, the steps we're about to show you should work for just about any Polaris side-by-side. So what we're going to do is check our wheel bearing first, and we're going to jack up the rear of the machine. And just make sure you do this in a safe manner. Once you have the wheel off the ground, what you want to do is rock the wheel top to bottom and side to side. And when you do that, you want to check for any play in any of the suspension components or just that wheel bearing. Could be anything back here creating some of that play. So it may be helpful to have somebody looking from the backside and checking where all the movement's coming from. Now, obviously this axle passes through that wheel bearing, so this is where we're going to be looking for play. If it's moving this, then you know that bearing is bad. You can see, that clearly does not look good at all. So again, we're trying to prevent a major breakdown out on the trail. So what we're going to do is we'll drop this back down, loosen up these lug nuts, and then raise it back up and take the wheel off. Now that we have the wheel off, what we need to do is remove this bearing carrier. So to do that, what we're going to do is remove this hub. We'll remove the brake caliper. It just has 2 bolts on the back. And then if you have a trailing arm like us, we'll disconnect all of these components, or if you have A-arms, disconnect those, and you'll remove it from this axle. So first thing, we're going to start with this hub, straighten out this cotter pin, remove it, then we'll remove that nut. Next, we'll remove the 2 bolts on the brake caliper. Then once you have the caliper off, I'm actually going to hang this using a bungee cord. That way we don't put stress on that brake line. All right, once you have the caliper off, we should be able to remove this hub. Might have to rock it off. Now, even though we're just focusing on replacing that wheel bearing, you still want to inspect the rest of the parts while you're here. So take a look at the rotor, make sure it's not cracked or deep grooves, anything like that in that. And then also these teeth inside this hub, they need to be in good condition and make sure they're not worn. You can, if they're worn down, you can feel some play on this axle. So check the teeth on the axle as well. And we'll go ahead, move on, and we're gonna remove our radius rods. Now, having these radius rods out of the way is going to allow us to remove that second caliper bolt. Next step, the bearing carrier. We have 4 bolts going all the way through, so we'll go ahead and remove those. And we'll remove that bearing carrier. Now that we're at the bench, our next step is to remove the snap ring from this wheel hub. So to do that, I'm gonna clean this area up just a little bit. You can use some contact cleaner and a rag. And to do this job, you're gonna need snap ring pliers that are heavy duty because this is a pretty tough snap ring. Once you've removed the snap ring, this bearing is always going to be driven out towards that side. So what we're going to do before we drive it out is heat this up. These things have a locking compound on the outside diameter to help them stay in place. So we're just going to heat it up. That's going to help remove this thing. And then on the back side, we have 3 little recesses that we can fit this punch into. And we'll drive it out that way. If your bearing, if the inner race is still in there, you can use a bearing driver to help hit it out, whichever one's easier for you. We didn't get this crazy hot, just warm enough to help get this thing removed. Then we've got some wooden blocks. If you have to, you might have to stack a couple of them up, and we'll drive that bearing out. Now, if you're having a hard time starting this bearing to drive out, one trick you can do is set the piece on the concrete. You're only going to be able to move it 1/4 of an inch or so, but you can hit it this way and it's going to be a solid surface to help get the bearing moving that first initial part. So that helped us drive this bearing out to the end of the bearing carrier. So what we'll do now is put it back on these blocks and finish driving it out the rest of the way. Now that this bearing is out, what you need to do is clean this thing up, make sure there's no damage to this housing, and if it looks good, we'll go ahead and reinstall the new bearing. And while you're cleaning this up and inspecting it, make sure that the groove for the snap ring is clean and not damaged as well. Now that the bearing carrier is cleaned up, we're ready to drive our new bearing in. But to do that, I'm actually going to heat this up. And if you wanted to, these actually come sealed in a bag. You can put these in your freezer to help them drive in a little bit easier. But just make sure this outer surface is clean, and then you need a sealing agent on this outside diameter. So the service manual recommends Loctite 603 on here. Really anything that specifies that it's made for bearings. So this Honda Lock 3, it's made for that and it'll work just fine. So we're just gonna put a little bit on there. And really you just need a thin coating. You don't have to go too crazy with it. And then this bearing, really you could drive it in either side facing down, but I'm just gonna put these markings facing up. We'll set that into place, make sure it's square. And then we'll take our bearing driver and drive it down. If you didn't have this, it is possible you could use this old bearing, but it's just a little bit cleaner way to do it. Now this is getting pretty close to being driven in. What we're gonna listen for is a change in pitch. That way you know it's bottomed all the way out, and then it's also gonna expose that groove for our circlip. So you could hear that was pretty obvious, the change in tone. So I'm gonna remove this, make sure it's perfectly even all the way around, which it is, and our groove is exposed. So now that this is driven in, what we're gonna check is make sure that some of the sealant didn't come up and over onto the top of the bearing. Wipe any excess off, and we'll check the bottom too. Make sure there's no extra sealant down here. We'll wipe that up. Next, we'll install the snap ring and make sure it's seated all the way into place. Now that our snap ring is installed, we're ready to install our bearing carrier back onto the machine. And I do want to point out that even though we're going to show you how to remove the wheel bearing carrier on the front as well, the steps for actually pressing the bearing out and back in will be the same for that. So for this, we're going to go ahead and go back over to the rear of the machine and get this installed. To get the hub back on, we're gonna put our drive shaft through it, and then we're gonna mount up these 4 bolts and this upper radius rod. Now, one thing I want to point out as we're putting these nuts on, these are nylock nuts, and Polaris recommends replacing them upon assembly. But we're actually just going to put a little blue Loctite on them and torque them down to spec. So the ones for this bearing carrier, we're going to torque all of these down to 40 foot-pounds, and then the ones for the radius rods, these are going to be 42 foot-pounds. Don't forget to put the lower caliper mounting bolt into the bearing carrier before you set this lower radius rod into place. And we'll tighten the bearing bolts in a crisscross pattern. All right, next step, we're going to install the wheel hub, and I'm going to apply a little bit of grease to these splines. You can also use anti-seize, whatever you want. And then I'm also going to apply just a very thin film of grease on the outside of this piece right here, just so it doesn't stick to the bearing, just in case we have to take this off in the future. So at this point, we can go ahead and slide this on to our axle. Make sure it's lined up with the splines. Then any excess grease that pushed out around the axle, I'm going to wipe that off. All right, with the hub in place, we're going to put our conical washers on, and the dome side will be facing out. So we'll put both of those on there. And then all these specs I've given, these are for our particular machine. Always make sure you're referring to your model specific service manual for the correct specs on your machine. Now, our axle nut, this one's actually going to go to 110 foot-pounds. And since this is a castle nut, once we've torqued it down, you may need to tighten it just a little more to get the holes for your cotter pin to line up. You never want to back it off from that 110. You would only go clockwise. So we'll go ahead and do that as soon as we put our brake caliper on, because that's going to help us hold everything into place. All right, so we've already placed that lower bolt for our caliper since the radius rod kind of gets in the way, but at this point you can put the top one into place, and it's not a bad idea to put a little blue Loctite on this as well. And on our machine, these are going to be torqued to 40 foot-pounds. And since this lower caliper mounting bolt is hard to reach, what we're going to do to tighten it up, we're using 2 wrenches for a little bit of leverage, and we're going to try to match this to the top bolt. If you're not going to do that, you can remove this lower radius rod again, let it hang down, and actually use your torque wrench on it. So it's up to you. I recommend using the torque wrench, but we're going to go ahead and do it this way today. So if you do it this way, you can just kind of match. As soon as that upper bolt that we already torqued starts to move, if you put the same pressure on this lower one, then you know you're just about the same torque. All right, next we're gonna tighten this castle nut down, and it's gonna be torqued to 110 foot-pounds. We'll also have an assistant hold the brake inside the cab of the machine while we do that. All right, now that you have this nut torqued down, make sure the groove in the castle nut is lined up with the hole in the axle so you can install your cotter pin. Ours lined up right at 110 foot-pounds, but again, if it's not quite there, you might have to go clockwise and just tighten it a little bit more to get it to line up. Then we can bend the tabs on the cotter pin. Polaris has you bend both of them the same way and wrap it around, but I'm just gonna do it just like any other cotter pin. Bend one up, and we'll bend this bottom one in. And now we can install our wheel. Our lug nuts are gonna be torqued to 120 foot-pounds, but again, that's a model specific spec, so check your manual. And always tighten the lug nuts in a crisscross pattern. All right, now that we've moved to the front of the machine, we safely supported our vehicle, removed the front wheel. Now we need to remove our cotter pin and this castle nut from the hub. So to help break this nut loose, I'm just sticking a pry bar on these studs. So you'll notice on this front, we've got the thicker washer behind this thinner one. Now we can remove these 2 caliper mounting bolts. So at this point we can go ahead and remove our caliper. Now is a great time to check and make sure that we have plenty of brake pad life left, and that there's no deep grooves on this rotor, and there's not a lip at the end where the middle's worn down. So if that's all looking good, then you don't need to worry about it. And again, I'm using my bungee cord to hang this caliper to keep all the pressure off of this line. Now we can go ahead and remove this hub. So for the tie rod end, we'll remove the cotter pin. Once you've done that, there's 3 bolts you need to remove. So what we have is our ball joint for the upper A arm or control arm, and then the lower ball joint, and then we have our tie rod end. So when you take these bolts out, it's going to be helpful to use a soft face mallet to tap on this to pop it up out of place. And as you can see, it's a little bit easier if you use a pry bar to finish separating the ball joints from the bearing carrier. So at this point, we can go ahead and slide this out of the way. Now that we have the bearing carrier off, as we mentioned before, replacing this bearing is the exact same process as the rear wheel bearing. So once you've replaced this bearing, you'll go ahead and reinstall it, make sure everything's cleaned up, and we're gonna go ahead and set this into place. We'll feed this through the axle and onto the lower ball joint, and we'll line everything up with the upper ball joint. Then we'll start installing our bolts. Now keep in mind, I'm gonna pull this down. You have that groove on these ball joints. The bolt that retains this has to go through that groove, and that way it can't go anywhere. So the other thing with the bolts is Polaris recommends replacing them every time. So if that's what you're gonna do, they're available on our OEM diagram. We're actually gonna reuse our bolt and just use some Loctite on those nuts. And these ball joint bolts are going to be torqued to 42 foot-pounds on our machine. Next up is the tie rod end. So we'll set that in place, install the bolt, and we're actually going to torque this nut down to 15 foot-pounds. Once it's tight, then you'll turn it an additional 90 degrees and install the cotter pin. We'll go ahead and clean up our hub, and then we'll apply some new grease to it, just like we did on the back. This is just going to keep anything from seizing up. You'd also use anti-seize if you want. I'm going to take my rag and wipe out this excess grease, any of that pushed out of the splines. Now we can reinstall the washers. Keep in mind we had the thicker one on towards the inside of the machine, and then the domed side of these washers will be facing out, so make sure they go on that way. And thinner washer on the outside. Install the castle nut, and we're just going to finger tighten this for now. We will install this brake caliper, so I'm going to unhook it from my bungee cord, separate these brake pads and set it down into place. Now for the brake caliper bolts, again, I'm applying a little bit of Loctite. These ones are actually going to be 30 foot-pounds, unlike the rear. All right, next we're going to tighten this castle nut down, and it's going to be torqued to 110 foot-pounds. We'll also have an assistant hold the brake inside the cab of the machine while we do that. So again, you're going to make sure the grooves in the castle nut line up with the hole through that axle, and then you'll install a new cotter pin and bend the tabs over. Now if you need any parts like these cotter pins or the wheel bearings, they're available on our website. We have a lot of different options on there. Now all that's left for our machine is reinstall the wheel, torque the lug nuts down, and lower it. And that's all there is to replacing the wheel bearings on your Polaris side-by-side. And if you haven't already, make sure you go subscribe to our YouTube channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.